that brings me to our last speaker, Sinead, because Sinead is an associate professor here in Trinity Business School, and she's a specialist in supply chain management, and she actually specialized as well in this notion of crisis in terms of for supply chain. So as Devon has illustrated, you know, there's many type of crises. Crisis can be due to an overwhelmingly big success, or on the contrary, it could be because your supply chain is broken. So I'd like to ask you your views, Sinead, about like how do you think this crisis has in fact affected supply chain for retailer? How bad or how good it has been in a very broad sense?
Yeah, thanks, Laurent, and thanks, Devon and Jonathan, for two very interesting perspectives there. Yeah, so I think I just want to spend the next 10 minutes or so just speaking exactly to that, the impact of this crisis on supply chains. So very much looking at the supply side of things. And I think, you know, to pick up on one of Jonathan's analogies, that, you know, our recovery is going to be very much a marathon and not a sprint. I absolutely agree, but I think it needs to be a new race from a supply chain point of view. We can't you know, go back to the mistakes and the errors of the past. So I think at this juncture, let me just share screen. So it should be sharing now. Yeah, so I think the way I like to think about COVID and position it from a supply chain point of view is that it is surely a black swan event. You know, something that has happened that wasn't predictable, but has had a huge impact. And we've seen that supply chain and the narrative around supply chains are now day-to-day parlance for most of us. You know, we're no stranger to these types of events and the impact they've had on supply chains. The financial crisis saw massively reduced demand. The Japanese tsunamis, the Thai floods have massively impacted our supply chains, particularly, you know, the tech supply chains. COVID-19, however, has been so catastrophic because it's affected both demand and supply, and has had a global impact. From a retail point of view, we know that retail supply chains just weren't engineered to cope with this level of disruption. From stores to the logistics systems to the distribution networks, supplier relationships, they just weren't set up to allow the agility of response that was needed. And we saw retailers up and down the country reactively respond to gear up every aspect of their supply chain and delivery systems, from procurement right through to customer service, in order to respond. We're still very much in the midst of the pandemic, and we don't yet know exactly the exact effect on supply chains. There's just not enough data there at the minute. But, you know, one thing that we can be sure of is that we need to change moving forward. We need to run that different race. We need to lay a different path. We need to think about crafting much more resilient systems, much more resilient operations and supply chains that support our retail systems, because they just didn't have the resilience that they needed. You know, we might question as well how, you know, why were we not ready? We know that these types of disruptions, call them high impact, low probability, if you like, these types of disruptive events have been on the rise. They are becoming more frequent and they are becoming more impactful. So we should have been forewarned. There has been lots of discussion in the supply chain literature, and, you know, it's part of my area, looking at risk response and development of resilience. But in practice, we're just not good at delivering on what we know as best practice, and we have designed supply chains that are vulnerable for very many reasons. We look at much more complex, distended, geographically dispersed supply chains, much more modularity, increasing number of handoffs between you know, different part suppliers. We're running much leaner systems. We're running on zero inventory often. We're focusing on cost. You know, the focus on cost, ignoring the other, you know, the cost below the surface, if you like. We're focusing on purchase price as the tip of the iceberg, and forgetting how else we can leverage procurement effectively to drive real value. We're focusing on sole sourcing. You know, having our key strategic parts or products, our key services delivered just by a sole supplier is just fraught with difficulty. And we see Apple, for example, fell foul of this. The coronavirus outbreak exposed so much of their dependency on China. And from a risk point of view, we talk about transparency, about visibility into our supply chains, but in practice, the majority of companies have no idea what their risk exposure is, and specifically for Asia, we don't know how badly we are exposed. These are all issues, these are problems, and we've known this. We know that we should be changing and adapting, but coronavirus strikes, and these factors and others have meant that we've suffered so catastrophically. The weak links become ever more exposed whenever you have such areas of vulnerability. We have absolutely buried our head in the sand on this. We should know better. Supply chain best practice is anything but the aforementioned. When we look at the dependence that we place across sectors, across industries on quarantine areas, you can see just the impact there of China. And the reality that China has affected every single supply chain that we touch. So coronavirus, in short, has completely immobilized so much of our delivery from a retail point of view. What does the future look like? Well, I think we've gathered already that online shopping is going to be the new norm. Until people can be confident being back out and enjoying that shopping experience, online is going to be prevalent. Transportation and warehousing are going to be front and center. So traditionally, almost the lesser considered of the supply chain functions, how we manage our transportation, how we manage our capacity for warehousing is going to be ever more important as we focus on direct to consumer models. Dark stores are going to become much more prevalent, where customers can confidently, safely and securely pick up their click and collect orders. We're seeing stores transformed. So not so people facing, but that click and collect option. Customer demands or expectations are escalating. The click effect, where you want product variety and instantaneous delivery almost. That's growing. Meanwhile, COVID has seen supply chains just shrink and product availability become a real concern. So we've got customer demands escalating, but the ability of the supply chains to provide really struggling. So we need to look at how we can deliver the product availability, the product choice at a convenient time and place for the customers. COVID really saw us reprioritize and think about discretionary versus non-discretionary categories. Yes, that's not going to be a long-term issue as we start to normalize again. But definitely COVID saw us reprioritize, and those discretionary categories and organizations and firms involved became transformed. We saw real innovation take place as you've got the Hermes and the high-end designers take to making face masks and the like. So we saw real innovation, and I think that will continue. It's got to continue as we look to create a much more agile, customer-focused supply chain system moving forward. We've touched on it again. I think Jonathan and Devin both mentioned this idea of the localization, local opportunity. Never risk a good, never waste a good crisis. We saw many local retailers and local firms really benefit from the customer preference to buy local and to support local. There's also the opportunity for SMEs and Devin, as well, that the ability or the agility that comes with being much smaller and flexible and agile in your processes and your people is undoubtedly a good thing. So what's success going to look like for retail moving forward? I think we really have to revisit the old pillars of agility and flexibility and supply chains. We talk about them, but what does it mean for retail moving forward? Yes, short term, it's going to be an emphasis on cash management for liquidity and solvency, but soon after, we really need to get down to the basics here on what resilience means and how we can craft resilience through thinking about our agility and our flexibility. flexibility. The localization, you know, how can we reorganize our production? How can we reorganize our manufacturing? How can we bring our procurement back to shore to have that quick response? How can we work much more collaboratively? We talk about collaboration and partnerships a lot in supply chain, but in practice, we're not necessarily so good at doing it in crisis events, at times of crisis. But there's a real opportunity here for actively seeking partnerships, not only within your own value chain, but beyond. You know, you share cost, you share risk. You could start to think about models where, you know, department stores are offering in-store pickup services to e-commerce companies, and likewise e-commerce offering online order fulfillment for department stores. We could see a emerging of the industrial sector and retail, with the focus much more on distribution and warehousing, and that fulfillment capabilities and innovation around fulfillment. Surely that calls for some greater collaboration between the industrial sector and retail. Procurement, moving away from these sole sourcing models and looking towards more localized procurement and building in capacity, building in redundancy. We're very anti redundancy often from a supply chain point of view, because it costs, and, you know, the storing of inventory, for example. But we need to think a little bit more strategically and critically about what inventory we should be storing as retailers, and what's going to be you know, what's going to be the value add for customers in that regard. And then starting to think about flexibility. You know, technology is undoubtedly going to pave the way here, and if anything, COVID has accelerated the focus on automation, on end-to-end delivery to customers. You know, we see it happen in grocery, and I think it's just a matter of time before we see that complete automated end-to-end customer delivery process just across so many other parts of retail. The potential of RFID here in terms of adding visibility and transparency, I think is critical. Flexibility. COVID was a great lesson for building flexibility into our retail and into our processes, looking at flexible staffing, flexible site facility. I think that's going to be here to stay. You know, we need to think about organizing our processes in a much less rigid manner, so that we can change and adapt to what is a very dynamic and uncertain marketplace going forward. Thinking more critically about product variety, you know, the sheer number of SKUs that many retailers are offering, how sustainable is that? Does that lend itself to the online delivery system, and from an order management and processing point of view, is it sensible? I think fulfillment is going to be central here, as we start to look at the localization, coupled with the fact that customers want much more speedy, instantaneous, you know, delivery options. How we consider fulfillment and how we innovate around that is certainly should be a focus of attention. Flexible logistics, looking to our 3PL partners, looking to flexible warehousing and the capacity associated. Certainly has to be a focus for supply chain systems going forward. You know, and I think it's to kind of circle back round on, you know, they're putting the head in the sand around all this and not retracing the old mistakes. I think we have to decide to either, you know, use COVID to draw that line in the sand, and to change what we do, how we do it, and how we deliver to the customers, or we will find ourselves in this position again.
Thanks a lot, Sinead. I mean, thanks a lot for this very comprehensive presentation on the supply chain implication of this crisis. I'm going to bridge the gap between, or bridge from what you've said to what the previous speakers have said, and maybe ask a question that you may answer, or that like the other speakers might jump on. Basically, from what you said, Sinead, and from the consumer behavior points that were made by both Jonathan and Devon earlier, seems like there's going to be two categories of ultra winner, if you want. On one hand, you have the local Okay, so local shop with local maybe supply chain, buying Irish, you know, buying like from your own national country, and those type of consumer behavior. And so with a mini reduced supply chain. And on the other hand, you seem to have like a very online, globalized, hyper globalized supply chains in the likes of Amazon, where you might buy from Amazon and with a supplier that is, and a seller, sorry, not even a supplier, a seller that is actually located in Germany, and who himself may, you know, get his parts and for his product from elsewhere, and you get it delivered to your house. So in other words, from a supply chain point of view, you have a hyper globalized, hyper extended supply chain that goes from the very producer that might be in China or elsewhere to the retailer that who might be in Germany to your doorsteps where the delivery is being made. So you've got this contradictory movement, and what's left in the middle, and that comes back to one of the questions that were asked by the attendee, is the national retailer, a non-online national retailer. That may be finding himself like pulling away from those, you know, national retailer maybe located in the city center, okay, to some of the point that you guys have made. I'll come back to, so I'd like to welcome your thought on this. And the follow-up question is, what's going to happen to the likes of a typical retailer like this, which would be Pennies, for example? What do you think of how they're going to survive? They don't have an online presence. We know they bounce back quite heavily on the first few days after the post-confinement phase, but
yeah,
thought on all of this.
I think to touch on the first part of that, I think we'll see a massive surge in online presence across those retailers, so that there will be a capability development probably very quickly and reactively to this COVID, and awareness that customer expectations are changing, and that they do expect to have some type of online channel through which they can procure services or product. You know, so many even services that we didn't assume to be to lend themselves to this online delivery have adjusted, and I think you would risk a certain demise if you weren't adapting and responding to this online need. So I think across the board that we will see online provision. You know, from counselling services to my sister's a dietitian, and you know they've got very terribly creative with dealing with patients in a very remote way. So I think this will be the new normal. In terms of Pennies, you know, I guess on one hand I'm surprised that they haven't tried to, I guess, the sheer size and the number of SKUs that they do run, but I would imagine going forward that there will be an online presence there. You know, I've used Zara case study quite a lot in my class, and you know, traditionally Zara was not considered to be a retailer that could have an online presence due to their business model, but they have adapted, and it's excellent. This was pre-COVID, so I think to discount the online model would be a shame for Pennies. I think there's opportunity to even run a more focused product lines, but I guess time will tell.